Hello and welcome to another episode of the Homebrew Pub, the only pub in existence where every beer on tap is made by a homebrewer. And on this ethereal plane, the Homebrew Pub will turn into the guest brewer's perfect brew pub. So please come in, grab a stool, and grab a pint. We are welcoming our first guest homebrewer to the Homebrew Pub. We're welcoming Colter from the podcast Homebrewing DIY.
Hey, Andrew. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, we've worked together on other podcasts. I've been on Pop Culture Brews. You've been on my show. You ever put a call out that says, Colter, be on a podcast? I'm always going to say yes. So here I am, excited to talk to you about homebrewing.
I appreciate that because you are a wonderful supporter of everything homebrewing and podcasting. So do really appreciate all the help you've given over the... God, it's been 2 years.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. And we spent 6 months of that trying to get you on Pop Culture Brews.
Well, there was a whole pandemic that happened.
Yeah. It was a small little thing. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, but, the day we brewed together was super fun. It was great. And we made Tyler watch The Room, which he still, I am sure, thinks is the worst movie he's ever seen.
He's not a fan. He doesn't... I don't think he gets it. So, to give a little bit of context to our listeners... I have another podcast, Pop Culture Brews. It's where we take pop culture we like and we brew beer inspired by it. And so Colter came around last summer and brewed a beer for this movie, The Room, which if you've heard of it, you need no introduction. And if you haven't heard of it, go and watch it. It is amazing. You might maybe have a couple of 10% beers beforehand.
You should go and watch it. It's an atrocious movie. It's bad in so many ways, and it's pretty much a softcore porn. So.
Yeah, that's fair. Wow, straight out of the gate, and episode 1 we're talking about porn. This classy podcast is off to a great start.
Well, we're also going to talk about beer too.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is true. But go and check out that episode of Pop Culture Brews. But Homebrewing DIY, it's been going for roughly 2 years as well.
Currently the show is a bit on a hiatus. I had a deal with a family member who has taken ill, and so I am currently in the process of taking care of that. I also got promoted at work, and so between those two, I've had to put the podcast a bit on a hiatus. Though I do have every intention of starting the show back up. I even have an interview in the hopper ready to roll.
Yeah.
I just have to sit down and edit it, and I haven't even had the time to do that. So
I know how that goes.
We all know how that goes, and I've even got multiple interviews lined up for the show. I just need to sit down and have them. So it is one of those things where I have struggled with time and family and all those things to be the creator that I want to be. That said, it used to be a weekly show, and it was all about the DIY aspect of homebrewing, right? It started off talking about the gadgets people built. We did get more into process and interviewing homebrewers all over the world. But I've also gone from individual homebrewers, like we're talking back and forth right now, to I've had, obviously, famous homebrewers as well in the brewing community. I've had Lars Gersal on, who I tend to love authors. I'm a big avid beer reader. I love reading about beer. I love learning about beer. And so pretty much if you've put out a new book over the last year about beer, I've tried to get you on the show. So those are kind of who I either want to learn from you or I want to know about what your process is. And that's really just what the show is about. It's a great show. It's got a pretty good sized backlog.
I was going to say, you've got
it's about 105 episodes.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely stuff to learn. You don't have to wait for an episode to come out. You could just go listen to it, and all of the info that's on there is pretty relevant even for today. So
yeah, no, I urge everyone to go and check out that show because it's such a different take on a lot of homebrewing. Really, as you say, I mean, we were talking before we started recording. The episode where I discovered you and got into it was two British chaps making beer out of tea brewing equipment in England, which, clearly I'm not a Denver native, even though the podcast says it's in Denver. But it was such a fun interview with these two guys who were just approaching homebrewing from such a different way. But then I was thinking about it, that they were just ahead of the curve on electric brewing. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and the tea urn, just to kind of put in perspective, a tea urn like that in the UK runs on a higher voltage than here in the States, right? Electric brewing in Europe in general is the way people just brew. Like electric brewing there is way more common than it is here. People think we're weird that we have propane burners sitting around trying to brew beer with like that kind of heat. Electric is the way they go in Europe, and that's across the board. I've seen some setups in Europe where they do 5-gallon buckets with heating wands in them, electric heating wands that they set in them. But those tea urns can actually boil water, which is pretty close to what you would get from like a mash and boil and those style of those electric breweries that are like the all-in-one. It's very similar to that style, and that's kind of what they made, right? That's essentially what they made, and they were kind of doing a brew in a bag method. But of course, as any home brewer does, even in talking to them, they were always trying to upgrade that system to something better. And actually, the last time I talked to one of the Cooksies, and I cannot remember his first name. Sorry, it's been 100 episodes since then. But I will tell you that the last time I spoke with him online, he had told me that he'd actually gotten a gig at a brewery and they were letting him make beer professionally.
Wow.
So it's one of those things where you start small and it can turn into something that ends up being a job.
And what a job to have.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind brewing beer for a living.
So, welcome to the Homebrew Pub, the only pub in the universe where every beer on tap is a beer made by a homebrewer.
That's awesome.
And so before we get into what beer you're gonna add to our tap list, what's your approach to brewing? Like, how do you approach recipe formulation? Does your process change depending on the beer? I mean, how do you think about brewing?
I would say when I started brewing, I started like everybody else. I started with extract kits. I think my first batch of beer was 1998. I used a Cooper's pre-hopped wort kit. It was pretty awful, actually. Very contaminated. I could only clean my bottles with iodine back then. You didn't have the kind of sanitizers you have today. It was just a very different game in the 90s. Brewed a couple batches then. Took a hiatus until about 2010 and then started brewing again. Obviously started with extract again. But very quickly on that second go-around got to all grain. And I've gone through a few different systems, from a brew in a bag system, many iterations of that, from like a turkey fryer all the way up to a giant kegel. Was making 10-gallon batches at that point. And I've moved myself now to where it's weird. I started with a 5-gallon kit, got to where I could do 10-gallon batches, and now I've generally, and I would say in the last year, have generally made about a lot of 1-gallon batches. I've kind of moved to that. The reason is that it takes a lot less equipment to do small batches. I generally am not drinking as much beer as I used to. I just getting through a 5-gallon batch right now is a lot harder than it used to be. Right? Well, pre-pandemic, it was easy to invite a bunch of friends over.
Totally get it.
They would tear through all your beer. And post-pandemic, yeah, it's great to have a friend or two over, but even then, it's not happening as often as it used to. And so, therefore, I found that at the beginning of the pandemic, I did drink 15 gallons of beer just to deal with that. And then after that, I realized, hey, that's probably not good for my health.
Yeah.
And then quickly into the starting to actually be in the pandemic is the better way to be, and just the new reality we've had for the last couple of years. It's just one of those things where I found that I couldn't get through beer fast enough. And I always want to have different beers that I'm drinking. And so I would say for the last year, I've been focusing a lot more on 1-gallon batches. And as part of the podcast, I was given a beer maker machine from the beer maker crew up in Boulder. Great little machine, actually. My homebrew club calls it my bread maker for beer.
Yep.
But I've been using the hell out of that thing because it's just so easy. I could do all grain batches.
Mm-hmm.
It works really well. And I would say a majority of my beers right now are actually coming out of my beer maker machine just because of the convenience. It's taken my brew day down to 15 minutes from 5 hours. So it is something where it's so simple to use that it's really just, but I always have beer on tap because of it.
Yeah.
So it's worked out well. That said, for the most part, I have brewed a few 5-gallon batches here and there. And as I have been, I'm still using an all-electric system. I have a mash and boil setup. It's an all-in-one home brewery where it's basically a play off of the brew in a bag. I actually brew in a bag in it, and I use a brew bag. I do all grain. I am pretty meticulous recipe-wise. I use Brewfather for my brewing software. I do build recipes from scratch. My recipe approach is a couple of things. First of all, I believe in simple recipes. I think that people you see this a lot when people are trying to mimic or clone beers where it'll have 0.5 ounces of Crystal 70 or 0.2 of 1 ounce of Crystal 120. I don't play that game. I try to keep things as close to a pound as I can if I'm doing it in pounds. If you're listening to this from the UK, obviously it would be metric, but we're here in the States, so everything here is done in pounds. And so I try to keep it that way. Hey, if I'm going to make a beer, I want to do it 10, 11, 12 pounds. I want to keep my base malt in full pounds. It's just easier to figure out, and it's easier to get in. And also, it doesn't really make that much of a difference.
It doesn't.
Right? It really doesn't.
No.
And then from there, when it comes to like specialty malts, I try to keep them simple. They have to be there for a reason. If they're not there for any reason, they go away. I tend to not use things like dextrin malts or anything like that often, unless it's there for a specific reason. Obviously, with like pilsners and stuff, there might be purposes for head retention that you have to have those. But for the most part, if I'm making a blonde ale, there's no dextrin malt in it. It doesn't matter, right? There's enough hops in it. It'll work just fine. And I just think in my mind that I want my recipes to be simple. I want my ingredients to be high quality. I think that that's a thing that people overlook a lot with homebrewing. We tend to get super into trying to be cheap, and I spend the extra money on good stuff. I'm a firm believer of if I'm making a British beer, I only use British malt. If I'm making a German beer, I only use German malt, and then I still even go for the good stuff when it comes to there. Floor malted Environment Pilsner, so good, right? And so it is that kind of, that's my approach. Is I actually believe that if I have quality ingredients, I'm actually going to make quality beer, and if I use good methods that are geared around good sanitation and process, that everything tends to work out. I would say when it comes to the thing that I try to avoid the most is obviously cold side oxidation. I think that it's funny. Back when I first started homebrewing, everybody was like, "Hey, you got to put it in secondary, man. Secondary, you got to get that beer."
There's
clear,
no
right?
need.
Yeah, no. Secondaries have been dead for a while, but that's what homebrewers focused on back then. Is hey, we want to get clear beer, and we want to make it look pretty, right?
I remember doing that when I started like 9 years ago. It was like you got to do it. I had like the second fermenter and everything.
Yep.
And you know, this was before I had my fancy, all steel with the spigot. So I'm trying to do like the bloody
Auto siphon,
not even auto siphon, just siphon. And it was such a pain that I just remember going, well, it's fine on the yeast cake for an extra week or two. And yeah.
I mean, discovering cold crashing was huge, right? Like, whoa! And so I could do this in a day. Yeah. So and the yeast cake is thick as hell, and it's gonna come off of it and doesn't suck up a bunch of yeast. This is awesome, right? But those were the kind of things that really have changed. But it's gone from a process where we started with really being focused on things like secondary fermentations and different dogmatic parts of brewing, to where I would say the modern dogma right now is like cold side oxidation is bad.
Yeah.
And really that comes from hazy IPAs being the big beer. And I I make hazy IPAs. I think everybody does at this point. If you're making IPAs, that's what an IPA looks like in America right now.
Mm-hmm.
And they're so sensitive to oxygen. You try to bottle one and they go purple almost every time, right? It's just like I go to breweries. Casey Brewing over in Glenwood Springs, one of my favorite breweries of all time. For a while, they were doing hazy IPAs and they were doing them in bottles, and I would buy bottles of them and I'd be like, "Oh, this is going to be great." Pour it out, and it's purple, right?
Yeah.
It's just because they're so touchy to oxygen, and so I would say that if there's something in my process right now that I really focus on, other than your standard just processes of homebrewing, it's really just mitigating any cold side oxidation. My beer maker machine does a great job of that because it never leaves its vessel ever, and there is no transfers, and so therefore there is no oxygen, and it's a fully temp controlled experience. But also when it comes to my fermentation, I ferment in kegs. I transfer keg to keg. I tend to not bottle often, and if I do, I bottle off a keg and it gets drank within 24 hours. I am very, very touchy about oxygen in beer. That's really, I would say, if there's anything that me and all my friends really focus on as a method, is to get that cold side oxygen out, because that's the thing that's going to make it so your beer doesn't last as long. If you have hop flavor and that's a focus, your hops are not going to be the same. They already change enough, right? They change over time. They change enough. Throwing oxygen into the mix just diminishes that over time. And those would be the things I would say I focus on.
I was gonna say, just going back to your beer maker, I've gone back and forth about wanting one. I remember seeing them on Shark Tank.
Yeah.
But the one thing I think they're really good for potentially is recipe formulation. Because the problem is when you're formulating a new recipe, especially if you're doing a big beer, like you're about to spend $100 on ingredients, if not more.
Yeah.
And if your recipe sucks, that you're out $100. But if you go down to like a 1 gallon thing, that might be 20.
Yeah, and I think it's good for that, but it does have some limitations. So I'm not going to say it's the end-all be-all machine out there. It's a great machine, and honestly, if you want to get into all-grain homebrewing for as cheap as possible, it's actually probably the cheapest way to do it. The machine itself is about $500, and it comes with a little keg thing with it, so it even has a little tap system with it. And I have to say, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you actually put together all the equipment and everything you would need to make a 5-gallon batch of all-grain beer and do it right, and that includes a kegging system, right? Because to me, if you're making all-grain beer, I'm not going to knock people that bottle. I think there are people out there that make great beer that bottle. But for me, if you're going to brew at the same level that I'm brewing at, and most of my friends do, we all have kegging systems, you're into the thousands of dollars.
Yep.
The kegging system itself is going to be above $500 alone, right? And then throw in an electric system or even a burner system with you can try to do it on the cheap, but even when you do, after it's all added up, you're thousands of dollars.
I was going to say, you look at an electric system, you're looking at 500 minimum. So
yeah.
At what point would you say a homebrewer realizes that either I've got to spend money or just make bad beer?
Some never do, right? Right? And I will say that one of the inspirations of homebrewing DIY was the lengths people would go to not spend money at some level, right?
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there are cool things out there. People taking air conditioners to make their own glycol systems. That's one of my favorite projects out there. But still, even then, that's an investment of money. Like, it's time and money. For me, time is money.
Yeah.
I have kids. I have a wife. I have work. I have all the things that I want to do in my life. And so I have to actually, I sit down and I think of my time as money. And if something's going to save me time and allow me to still get the high quality, I think it's worth spending the money on.
Yeah.
I look at my neighbor's system, and we talk about it on my podcast all the time because he's a frequent guest on the show, and he's got a great electric system that he's built out himself, and he's making such good beer right now.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you were to say, somebody's at the height of their beer making. My neighbor right now is crushing some seriously great beer right now. And it is something where when I look at his style, the way that he makes beer, and the fact that he built a system that cost him thousands of dollars, and if he went to go try to sell it, he would never get that out of it, right?
No.
It's secondhand. Yeah, we all expect that. Oh yeah, I spent $6,000 on the system. I'm gonna go sell it for $6,000. No, that's not how any of this works.
It's a used car at that point.
It's a used car at that point.
You lost 10 grand on it on the first brew.
It's a depreciating asset, right? But even then, it is something where his time and investment in actually having quality stuff has paid off.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, to me, that's the balance you need to make, is once you pick a style, whether it's a 3-vessel system, a brew in a bag system, I gotta say, once you pick that, go all in.
Mm-hmm.
Do it and do it right. You'll never regret the beer you make.
To me, that's the whole point of this, is like to make beer you like and make beer you can share with friends.
Yeah. Well, and there's nothing more amazing than the day you drink a beer and you're like, man, I could have got this at the brewery. Like,
yeah.
When you actually make a beer that tastes like that, it took me about 6 or 7 batches to get there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like it happens overnight. When you first start off, you're going to have these off flavors that are just, you're like, oh man, I gotta, good notes are going to also help, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, once you start making brewery quality beer consistently, and you bring your friends over and they think they're drinking commercial beer and it's your homebrew,
mm-hmm.
that to me is like a moment in being a homebrewer that you're just like, wow, that this is why I'm doing this, right?
Yeah.
So
totally agree. I want to know, what is the best beer you feel you've ever brewed? Like, what beer are you adding to the tap list of the homebrew pub?
Yeah, it's a great question because I've made so many beers in my past, right? But I would say, looking at the best beer I've ever made, looking at a couple of, I've won gold medals in my past, right? And those beers always turned out really well.
Well, clearly.
And I won my first gold medal with a Kentucky Common. And the reason I'm going to use that one is because, A, it's a great one to put onto the show and it's easy to make. Plus, at the time, it was right at the beginning of Kentucky Commons becoming a resurgence. And so the cool thing about it is we don't really know what that beer tastes like if you think about it.
Yeah.
And so it's really our modern interpretation of it. And so what my recipe looks like for a great Kentucky Common is you have to use 6-row malt. Remember, I'm an ingredient snob, and so for me, if I'm going to make a great beer, I want to be true to the style. And one of the things that, if you read the historical documents around it, it always came with 6-row. You can make it with 2-row. It would probably be fine. But 6-row has just a slightly different flavor. It's a little huskier. It's a little bit more. It's just got a little bit more earthy flavor in my mind than you get from 2-row. It's definitely not as. It does have its own unique flavor, especially when you taste the two side by side. You can, like, you actually chew the malt, you can taste it, and it does taste different. So I'm a firm believer that the base malt needs to be 6-row, right?
Yep.
And so you start with 6-row barley. I would actually do, if you're making a 5-gallon batch, you don't need a lot. It's got to be like 8 pounds of 6-row barley, right? You're not looking for, this beer is supposed to be 4 to 6% in alcohol. It's not intended to be a gigantic beer. You're going to see, I've seen interpretations where they're sour. No, they're not supposed to be sour. I've seen interpretations where they're like 7%. No, they're not supposed to be 7%. This is meant to be a beer that you would have bought in the early 1900s, and low ABV beers were actually a thing back then, and very, very common. It was a common beer. It's not supposed to be a high ABV, right?
Yeah.
So shooting for that 8 pounds of 6-row, you do have to have corn in it. It's essentially a cream ale, right? So you're going to do corn, you're going to do flaked corn, and you only need it to be about 20% flaked corn. So if you're doing 8 pounds, you only are going to need about, we're looking at a 10-pound grist, you're going to need about 2 pounds of that. Right?
I was going to say about 1.5 pounds if my maths is correct.
Yeah, exactly. So I do about 2, so it might be a little bit more. But so remember, I always do in whole numbers, right?
Yeah.
So
see, I will happily do a 1/2 pound.
Yeah, 1/2 pounds are fine, but I don't. I tend to go with whole pounds.
Well, you're the gold medalist here.
I am, but it was 8 pounds and 2. It was 8 pounds and 2 pounds. And then the other thing is, it's got to be a black beer, right? So the traditional cream ale is essentially just like 2-row and flaked corn. This is 6-row flaked corn, and then you're going to add cluster hops, and that one throws people off because you're like, yeah, a little bit of cat piss. That's what cluster smells like. But traditionally, cluster was like one of the first hops that were being exported from the States, and so it is a very American beer and American style, and that's what was available back then. And so I used cluster hops in mine. And as far as the last malt that goes into it, you literally a small handful, not like an ounce or 2 of some black patent to just darken it up, because it is a black beer. And so essentially the story of the beer was that in the Kentucky Common, they essentially had a lot of German immigrants, and that's who they were serving beer to. And so they would make this beer, and they would just throw a handful of dark malt into it to just make it be a little darker, so it was like the beer they were drinking.
I was going to say more like a Dunkel or something.
Yeah, exactly. But it didn't have the flavor of it. It was a cream ale. That's how they got the body, was with the corn.
Yeah.
Right? Which is that American style, right? And then cluster hops, and as far as that goes, you're only looking at a 1 ounce addition of cluster in the boil, and then you're going to probably, if I remember my recipe correctly, it was a 1/2 ounce at 10 minutes just for a little bit of aroma. Nothing super crazy. Very, very simple recipe. But the key here is the 6-row really makes a huge difference, and it is meant to be a very fresh beer. So this is not a beer that you're going to want to sit on for a long time. Essentially, it's a low ABV beer. It's going to be done fermenting in about 7 days, and you really want to carve it up quickly and get it out and serve it right then and there. It is meant to be really fresh, and it to me is a beer that loses a little bit as it ages. So you want to drink it very, very soon after making it.
Nice. And we'll be including that recipe in the show notes as well. So if you want to be drinking along with us or brewing along with us, always go to the show notes of the episode, and you'll find the recipe for the beer that we just added to our tap list.
So you're going to ask me about my worst beer now?
I was going to ask you about the worst beer. And again, like at the top of the episode, we're talking about the room, which again, I'm not going to tell the story of how you brewed that beer on the day. Let's just say it was a bit of a show. So please go and listen, because that is actually one of my favorite episodes of Pop Culture Brews, because it's very funny.
Oh man, your drapes.
Totally they're still stained. But I expected you to be like, I want to talk about the room beer. But you're like, no, that's not the worst beer. And I'm like, how? What did you do?
Yeah, I made this British golden ale, and it was like, I wanted a British golden ale. I love British golden ales. I think they're delicious. To me, it was like it was my first attempt at it, and just something went off in the fermentation. I don't know what happened. I used SO4 for the yeast in it, which is usually a really solid yeast. Never had problems before, and I to this day have no idea what went wrong with it. But there's something went off in the fermentation. That's exactly what happened. It was a fermentation issue, and it tasted like pure Band-Aids. Like it was like chemically.
Oh, I've had that.
Yeah, and it was awful, but it was so strong that it was undrinkable, and I actually had to pour all 5 gallons out. And I'll let you know. Don't get me wrong. I've had beers I've made that I don't love, but I'll still drink them. That's fine. Right. That. I don't love this beer. I did something wrong with the recipe. That's not the best, but it's drinkable. It's fine. I'll just drink it. Right.
Yeah.
But I've never. There are very few beers I've actually had to dump out, and I've had very few infections throughout my homebrewing career. But this beer was one where I was like, this is undrinkable.
Yeah.
And I had to dump it out. It just had this chemically Band-Aid flavor that was so atrocious.
Do you know what I wonder what that was? Because I've had this. So at the beginning of quarantine, I was going to brew 2 quarantine beers in the good old days when we thought it was 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And both of them got infected with the exact same infection. And
see, I don't think the Band-Aid flavor is infection. I believe Band-Aid has to do with it's actually like fusel alcohols, and you have.
Oh, okay.
It's essentially, I think I fermented it up too hot. Is actually what happened, and it was an off flavor from the fermentation because it did ferment all the way out. There was no infection. There were no weird bubbles. There was no other off flavors. It didn't smell like puke. To me, infections always smell like puke.
Yeah.
And so I really think it had to do with I ran the fermentation hot. There probably was something wrong with my fermentation chamber at the time, which I've since got rid of. But yeah, if that's the only thing I can think of, was that it was something wrong with my fermentation temperature that really just threw the beer off. That's really what it is.
Okay, because I was going to say that I've had instances when I didn't treat... So I use Denver water out of the tap. I don't really treat my water. Denver tends to be pretty good. But I've started using Camden tablets because... I forget what it is, but essentially the yeast attaches to the chlorine or the chloramine. Chloramine, thank you.
Yeah.
Chloramine in the water, and you get that medicinal taste to it.
And that could very well be it. I for years, I live in Jefferson County, which is a little bit different than Denver water. My water here is the same water they put in Coors. It comes right out of Clear Creek, right? And our water tastes amazing here. It really does. It's like out of the tap. My water is so good. I'm from Utah originally, and our water there tasted atrocious. It was like you would boil and it would like leave crystals inside of your pot.
Yeah.
So hard. Made the best stouts.
I'm sure.
But like try to make an IPA and it was like atrocious. You had to soften the hell out of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I got used to, because I was from there and our water was so bad, I would start with distilled water and add individual salts to the styles I was making. And only in the last couple of years have I been just like, Denver water is actually good. And I've had zero problems with my water here in Jeffco. But our water, the thing about water is, does it taste good already? It's probably going to make good beer.
Yeah.
Like you taste your water. Does it taste good? If your water tastes like crap, you're literally gonna it's never gonna help your anything. It's only gonna make it worse, right?
It's 90% of the recipe.
Yeah, it is. It's like 97% of
97,
water, right? Or whatever. And beer is pretty much water, right? So if you use crappy water, you're gonna make crappy beer.
Yeah.
This instance, I don't think was the problem, because this was a time when I was building my own water, and so I would have used distilled. And I would have put salts in it based on the water profile I was going after, which would have actually been styled after the beer I was trying to make, right?
Yeah.
So I would have went for a malty, a golden malty beer, because that is what you're looking for in a British golden ale.
Yeah.
Another thing is that, to be honest, since I've become a more advanced brewer, I would want to put that on nitro anyway. That's just,
yeah. I have my nitro system.
Yeah, and see, like if I were gonna do a British style beer like that now, I would want it on nitro.
Yeah.
It's just the body that you get on a nitro beer like that is what you're looking for, and that's the way you could do it at home without having to like install your own beer engine.
Yeah.
And so, it to me is like that's what I would do.
Yeah, no, I have my nitro system purely because I don't drink, even though I'm drinking a holiday stout right now. I don't drink a lot of dark beers, so because I find a lot of them very heavy. So I do like a good British ale that is very thin in body, tends to be low ABV, but I don't like them fizzy, which is what a lot of... I remember, actually, the episode I came on for yours, we debated this. A lot of them are fizzy, so that's why I was like, I'm putting in a nitro system.
Well, and the nitrous actually gives them body, right?
Yeah.
You're already looking at, hey, it's a 3.5% beer. You throw it on nitro, it gives it the body to actually feel like you're not drinking the water.
Yep.
And those beers are some of my favorites, and we've talked about this many times. Like Hogshead Brewing here is so good.
So good.
And one of my favorite breweries, and I've never been to the UK. You obviously have. And so it would be something where, if you're sitting here saying it's so good, that says something,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that's what happens when your head brew is a Brit. So
True. Well, it actually does it the right way, right?
Yeah.
There's no shortcuts there. Those casks are done the way they would do them in the UK, and their hand drawn beers are I would say as close to anything that I've had bottled from the UK. But even then, it's not the same. It's that thick head.
It's that thick head and just
that thick head. Oh man, they're so good.
You can't beat it.
I got a friend that lives across the street, and every time I go to his house, and I'm like, "Hey, let's just hop across the street."
Let's go Hogshead. Well, speaking of breweries, we are in this mystical brew pub, which turns into whatever you want your brew pub to be. So, what would be the name, or what is the name of your brew pub, and what is the atmosphere you're going for?
My personal brew pub, if I were going to make one, would also be geared around food. I think that one of the things that people don't look at with beer enough is that it does go really well with food. Maybe it's I have very deep restaurant roots. That's really where I come from, and so for me, you've got to have beer with food, and food and beer complement each other so well. And a lot of us, and especially in the homebrewing world, never really put that together. But to me, it's like, you know what? A light, crisp lager and Mexican food, they go well together really well, right? And especially a malty lager. That's why Vienna lager is so big in Mexico. Those type of malty lagers really go well with that style of food. And when you're eating spicy food, that crispness actually cuts through the spicy, and actually takes a bit of the heat away, right? Which is great. And then, but then it's like if I'm sitting there and I'm eating something that's a little bit more hearty, like a meatloaf and mashed potatoes and things like that, that's actually when I'm looking for that British style beer, right?
Yeah.
They're gonna that soft body and a little bit of it can be still low ABV, but that kind of thing goes well with it, right? Obviously, I'm not necessarily saying that that's the style of food I'm going to make, because to be honest, if I were going to make a brewery, I would do all lagers. Super into lagers right now. I would do an all lager brewery, and I would be very experimental with the type of lagers I was doing, whether it be plays off of traditional. Right now, I think I would definitely have a Italian Pilsner on it, just because they're so good right now.
Yeah.
It's so they're so hot right now.
So hot.
And I'm drinking lots of them as of right now. But then and what I'd go with is a spicy Korean chicken sandwich, because all Korean food is also super hot right now. That's what I'm going with.
Very nice. And so, what would the atmosphere be? Would it be centered around Korean, or would it be centered around Italian, German? Like, what would
I would actually make it be like this.
Yeah.
I would make it super small. Think very, very small. And I would always make sure there was a line for those Korean sandwiches.
Just hiring people to stand in line.
Yeah, totally. if you make a line, then all of a sudden you have a line.
Yeah, this is true.
I also know how to market a restaurant very well.
You do.
And so the idea is that it would be like, hey, let's make sure we have a line for this, and then we'll just happen to sell beer for the sandwich. That sandwich's pretty good. You know what would go really good with it? You want a beer?
Well, I can tell you we have now mystically transformed. The line is around the entire restaurant. I'm drinking an experimental lager, and I am in line for that food.
Yep, and just if it was ideal, I would have I would have people going down that line, going, "Hey, man, you want a beer while you're waiting in line?"
See, you are good at marketing restaurants.
Yes, I try. So that's. But to me, it would definitely have some sort of food component that would be geared around that would go well with whatever beer I was making.
And what would you call it?
Oh man, you're now asking hard questions.
Colter's Lager Shop.
No, it wouldn't be anything like that. First of all, I have this whole theory where naming your restaurant after yourself is like naming your kid Junior. Like it's just a pure ego trip, right?
Yep.
So like whenever you see a restaurant that's called Harry's or George's or Joe's, I'm always just like, come on, man. Like you probably name your kid Junior, right? And so it's like to me, if I were gonna make the name of a restaurant, which I still have no idea, or bar, I don't know what I would call it.
Yeah.
It would go with the theme. It'd be like, I don't know, Red Hot Chicken. I don't know.
There you go. That's good. Well, everyone.
Red Hot Chicken and beer.
Well, everyone, you're missing out on being here at Red Hot Chicken and Beer. The food smells great, the lager is cold and crisp, and the company is fantastic.
And we'll sling you kimchi on the side.
We'll sling you kimchi on the side. This has been absolutely awesome. It's always so great to catch up with you.
Always a pleasure.
I would like to thank my guest Colter for coming on, and I recommend to everyone listening, go and check out the back catalogue of his podcast, Homebrewing DIY. It is one of the best homebrewing podcasts out there. As he said, there's well over 100 episodes, all of them with great information, great interviews. Every episode you're going to learn something new. So, yep, go check out Homebrewing DIY. And of course, thank you so much for listening. If you could leave us a 5-star review wherever it is you get your podcast, that'll just help other people find the show. If you want to reach out to us, possibly come on and share a pint with me, you can reach us at our website, thehomebrewpub.com, or email landlord@thehomebrewpub.com, or on social at The Homebrew Pub on Instagram and Twitter. And if, like me, you hate those annoying ads, well, we've got to keep the lights on here at The Homebrew Pub somehow, so consider joining our Patreon and becoming a Mug Club member. For $3 a month, you'll get access to ad-free versions of the episodes. But until then, grab your favorite pint, put your feet up, relax, don't worry, and have a homebrew. Till next time, cheers.